So how many of you know dialysis or know somebody on dialysis or are familiar? Okay, that's about right. Dialysis is a therapy that was invented in the middle of the 20th century to treat kidney failure. So this was a medical breakthrough at the time. Before dialysis, those with kidney failure experienced rapid death. And this was invented, the story is interesting that I don't have time to get into, but it's a way to filter toxins from the blood that was invented. And suddenly, we could save people's lives who otherwise we couldn't earlier. The problem with dialysis, or one problem with dialysis, is that, as the picture illustrates, it hasn't changed much since it was invented. There have been lots of incremental improvements, but fundamentally it is the same therapy. And more importantly, the patient experience on dialysis is the same. And just think about this time frame and think about all the things that were invented from 1962 until now. Entire industries created, entire industries destroyed. This was the time span in which dialysis remained fairly constant. So if you sort of zoom back around kidney disease in general, this is actually a fairly big issue in the US and worldwide. About 30 to 40 million people, depending on who you ask, have some form of chronic kidney disease in the US. Every year, 100,000 people begin dialysis. And the mortality rates for dialysis are about 50% of people who begin dialysis die within 5 years. So this is about the mortality rate of a lot of cancers. About half the people with advanced kidney disease don't even know they have it. So this is another issue at play. And if if that isn't bad enough, well, at least it's really expensive to treat. This is a disease, kidney failure is a disease that automatically qualifies you for Medicare. So if you're 20 years old and your kidneys fail and you get on dialysis, you are eligible for Medicare. The amount of money that we spend through Medicare alone on end-stage renal disease is about the budget of the NIH. So just think about that. It's our entire biomedical research budget is the cost of this therapy. It's about 7% of Medicare annually. It's about 1% of the entire federal budget, and it's going up because hypertension and diabetes and other factors are increasing in the US. So some of you might be thinking, okay, message received, kidney disease, public health crisis. But surely there are smart people in California and Boston and other places in the US hatching a solution to this problem. And my answer to that is, well, not really, but that's what we're trying to change. And one example of this is a graph of the venture capital money in biopharma. So on the right, you see the year-by-year numbers of total venture capital funding, and around $9 billion, a healthy amount. If on the left, you look at the breakdown by disease, and unsurprisingly, cancer is on the top of the list. What you don't see in here is kidney disease or anything in the renal space. And if you look to devices, more specifically, two things. One is that there's a lot less money in medical devices than there is in the rest of biopharma. Secondly, again, breakdown by disease, you do not see kidney disease or renal in here. The point being, this is not on the radar of investors. This is not on the radar of a lot of the healthcare industry, despite its massive cost and burden. And there's a bunch of issues at play, but I think the biggest one in my mind is what I call the good enough syndrome. So we invented dialysis. We have kidney transplants. By the way, kidneys were the first organ transplanted, so that's the other piece of the puzzle that I won't get into because there's a massive organ shortage, right? So there's a lot of people on the waiting list for a transplant. But there's this good enough syndrome, right? We pay for treating end-stage renal disease. We have dialysis. Problem solved. Let's throw a bunch of dialysis clinics in mini malls across the country and call it a day. So we've fallen into this trap, right? And we've developed an entire healthcare infrastructure. So our payment system, the way we train physicians and clinicians, the way healthcare is delivered is all centered around a single therapy, right? And so that has the unintended consequence of stifling innovation, of stifling the idea of trying to think about what else could we do that's better. Kidneys are also a complicated organ, 37 or so cell types, very complicated in terms of what it does. So there's a lot of scientific gaps at play. But if you look at the ecosystem of startups, of investors, there's very little out there, right? There's very little money out there in terms of research investment, and there are very few investable ideas or companies out there. And the way we're attacking this problem, and I think there's sort of 3 layers to this. One is a financial piece of this. So what we're trying to think about is how do we create smoother pathways of investment all the way from good idea at the beginning into commercialization, increasing end-to-end capital. And I think the only way to do that is to find ways to share risk between government, the nonprofit sector, and industry. And I'll talk about how KidneyX is trying to do that. Secondly is the perception issue, right? This is, nephrology is a, if you look at the fields that are the most attractive for medical students to specialize in, nephrology is not anywhere at the top of that list. It is not an exciting field necessarily for a lot of folks, and so there's a pipeline of talent issue there. And I think part of the issue is around the conversation in this space. For a long time, there's a sense of hopelessness, and we're trying to change that around into thinking about this as an area of opportunity, right? Of a place where innovators should think about spending their time and money and their thoughts. And along with that is sort of expanding the notion of what's possible, right? Creating a future state of possibility that's exciting for people and can help a significant amount of people who need it. And third is a policy angle, and this is a lot where we come in, right? So this is systematic through all of healthcare, but I think in particular it's very poignant in the kidney space, which is thinking about clear pathways for entrepreneurs, for companies to navigate regulatory and payment processes, right? Thinking about clinical trial design, thinking about payment and FDA approval in a more coherent way. And all of that sort of gets around this idea of trying to reduce the aggregate cost of development of medical products, which is just a burning issue, I think, in the healthcare system in general. And along with that is just demanding innovation, right? Sending out signals that say, we want something better for patients. Our goals in KidneyX are sort of twofold. So the first two, which hope to lead to the third and fourth. So one is we're pulling money together through a public-private partnership that I'll talk about in a second, and offering a series of cash-based prize competitions to define patient and clinical unmet needs. And so our goal is to target entrepreneurs, innovators who don't normally think about replying to grant solicitations, to working with the government. We're trying to reach those innovators who come from a variety of fields who I think as a community could think about how do we build things like an artificial kidney, right? Secondly is what I talked about earlier, which is finding ways to improve coordination across our agency. So you heard it earlier, but we're the largest funder of biomedical research in the world. Depending on the economy, we ensure the safety and efficacy of about 20 to 25 cents of every consumer dollar spent in the US. And we're the largest health insurer in the world, right? So we have these pieces and these levers, and thinking about them coherently is one of our goals. And third is, I think if we do 1 and 2, our real goal is to de-risk commercialization, right? To unlock more investment capital, to encourage more shots on goal, to think about kidney space, to turn kidney space into what I think oncology and cardiology are today, right? Where there's just a lot of excitement, there's lots of ideas in the pipeline, things like that. And fourth, along with that, is just to create a sense of urgency, right? This is a chronic condition, massive burden, massive cost, but we don't think about it with the same sense of urgency we often do with infectious disease outbreaks, right? Just think about the difference there and how we respond to the two. I won't go into this, but let me hit 2 things. So when we started, we created a set of principles. We treated this as a startup, so no matter where we went with this, we wanted to adhere to these. So the first is patient-driven, right? We are trying to include patients at every point in the process, and not just be patient-centered, but have patients be involved in the process, right? And healthcare typically works in the way where, in the corner over there, somebody's developing the widget. And then once they have a prototype of the widget, they'll go and ask a clinician or they'll go ask a patient what they think of it. And we're trying to flip that around a little bit and say, we need patient insights from the beginning. That should be the starting point. The fourth one down there is catalytic. We're never going to be in a place with this project that every kidney innovation is going to come through us, right? And so our goal is not necessarily to capture everything to be the main pillar, but to be catalytic, to encourage more people to think about innovation in this space in different ways. We partnered with the American Society of Nephrology. They committed $25 million to this effort, and this is sort of the initial cornerstone of this public-private partnership that we're creating here. And the reason, I mean, this makes sense, right? From the government perspective, we are all the things that I mentioned earlier. We need the expertise of clinicians and patients, and so we've partnered not only with ASN, but with patient groups to get their perspective and input in the process as well. I mentioned, so we're operating a series of prize competitions. The first prize we launched last year was an early stage prize broken into two phases, a design phase and a prototype building phase, and that we call Redesign Dialysis. And the goal of this is to start setting and building the pipeline for post-dialysis technologies, to think about how do we replace renal function in a completely different way than we've been doing it now. And some of the areas that have been scoped out in this are things like developing portable or wearable dialysis machines. And there's an important patient component here, right, where that actually unlocks you from being tied down to a machine. What I didn't mention earlier, and those of you who know dialysis know this, but if you're on dialysis, it is your life, right? You are there at least 3 times a week, 4 to 5 hours a day. And while you're not on dialysis, you're tired and thinking about your next session, right? It takes and consumes your life. So thinking about portable solutions is a very patient-centric approach to giving people their life back in some ways. And then thinking about technologies like surgically implantable dialyzers, and then even regenerated kidneys. And so this was actually based on an effort that I should mention that we did alongside KidneyX. This is a partnership called I don't know why I'm blanking on this. This is a partnership between the American Society of Nephrology and the FDA to think about all the systematic issues in the kidney space. And one of the things that they did was they developed a technological roadmap for renal replacement technologies. And so here they laid out all of the scientific and engineering unsolved problems that, if they were to be addressed, could lead to the development of these technologies. And so we layered KidneyX on top of that effort and said, we're offering money and a vehicle for people to propose ideas that address those issues. So the first prize, 2.6 million, oh, there you go. So these are just some of within that report that I just mentioned. Patients were part of the process. These are some of the issues that they laid out in terms of any new technology in this space has to address these issues, because this is what patients want and need. And so again, we layered our prize with this, with these elements and these I guess, specs in there. The design phase is a relatively small amount of money, so we are awarding $75,000 for up to 15 winners. Submissions closed recently. We got 165, which is a great response, and we're going to announce the winners at the end of the month. Oh, I should say, too, that I mentioned being patient-driven, patient-centric. Patients were part of the review process, so again, we wanted to flip that script and say patients should be, at the table. We required every submission to have talked to patients about their design before submitting, because we wanted to get that input early on. And we had patients as reviewers. In fact, there was one patient reviewer who was on dialysis and didn't have access to email or the internet, and so they had to fax their scores into us, which was an interesting endeavor. But it just showed that we're trying to reach out to those who don't often get a voice. The next phase of this is a prototype building phase, and I don't know how I am on time. All right, 4 minutes. That's going to kick off pretty soon. This is where we're going to seek testable early stage pre-human trial prototypes of one of these components or an entire device, depending on where people are at. And that's going to go through the rest of the year. And at the same time now, we're thinking about building a phase 3 component of this with a lot more money attached to it. that's going to encourage further development into human trials for devices. So I mentioned I focused on dialysis, but this whole effort is really around prevention, diagnosis, and treatment. And so we are at the same time now scoping other areas where we can offer this kind of catalytic effort to close that gap between research and where investors are comfortable making investments. So we're looking at other areas of therapies, of drugs that can slow progression potentially, of patient-centered tools that can help patients along the journey at various points, better diagnostics, things like that. So we're currently sort of scoping all that out. And I should also say that I mentioned catalytic. We've also had an interesting catalytic effect within the department. When we launched KidneyX, it kind of led to a whole bunch of conversations around what else can we do as a department to transform kidney care. And the secretary, in a speech last month at the National Kidney Foundation, laid out kind of the beginnings of a new initiative that we're starting at HHS, of which KidneyX is a component that really has 3 goals that looks at this whole issue a little more holistically. So one is, what can we do to slow progression of kidney failure? How can we invest in prevention in new ways that we're not doing now? How can we double down on those successes that we've seen in a lot of prevention efforts as well? Secondly is just improve ESRD treatment. How do we think about our payment incentives through Medicare to encourage better forms of treatment of transplants, of things like that? And align patient outcomes and goals with how we pay for care. And third is addressing the organ shortage issue, and how do we get more access to kidney transplants in general by thinking about the issues around living donation and deceased donors for kidneys. So, I will stop there, but let me just say a couple things. One is that, again, I think this is a model that could be applied to other areas. So anything you think, you can think about where there's this just high burden, this high cost, and there's an opportunity to attract talented individuals and organizations from potentially different spaces or a combination of spaces that could really lend themselves to solving that problem. And so this is a model we're thinking about in some of the other areas as well. But I will leave it there. If you have any questions, I don't know if we have time for questions, but my email is there, Twitter handle is there. Check out our website, kidneyx.org, if you want info. Thank you very much.